Commander Dak enjoyed watching his prey suffer. Standing on the gleaming bridge of the subjugator, his massive warship, he observed the holographic displays showing his troops rounding up the peaceful Nilarans. Their screams brought a cruel smile to his scaled face. The harvest was going perfectly. The Nilarans were a simple farming species, perfect for the labor camps. Their strong backs and natural endurance would serve well in the mines. Their planet, with its endless fields of golden grain, had been laughably easy to conquer. No defenses, no weapons, just frightened creatures running from his soldiers. Another successful conquest. Dak rumbled to himself, his clawed hand adjusting the ceremonial collar that marked his rank. The Vrath Empire had dominated the slave trade for centuries, and he was one of their most successful commanders. Under his leadership, dozens of species had been added to their collection of worker races. The bridge crew worked silently at their stations, scales gleaming under the harsh lights. None dared to speak unless spoken to. Dak had a reputation for executing subordinates who annoyed him. The only sounds were the soft beeps of equipment and the occasional whispered status report. "High Commander," a voice broke the silence. It was Jin, his second in command, approaching with a data tablet. Unlike most Vrath, Jin was unusually thoughtful, sometimes to the point of cowardice, in Dak's opinion. "What is it?" Dak growled, annoyed at having his moment of triumph interrupted. "Sir, our long-range sensors have detected signals from an unexplored region of space," Jin reported carefully. "We've decoded their transmissions. The species calls themselves humans." Dak's scaled lips curled into a dismissive sneer. "Another primitive race for our collection. Plot a course once we've processed this batch of slaves." "Sir," Jin persisted, "I really think you should review the preliminary data. Their technological advancement rate is unprecedented. In just the last century, they've gone from primitive combustion engines to—" "Spare me your concerns," Dak interrupted with a snarl that made Jin step back. "No species has ever successfully resisted the Vrath. These humans will be no different. They'll serve in our mines and factories like all the others." Deep below the bridge in the crowded holding cells, a young Nilaran named Sung huddled with his fellow captives. Their captors had stripped them of everything: clothes, possessions, dignity. The metal floor was cold against their skin, and the air stank of fear and despair. Sung's sensitive ears picked up the guards talking outside the cell. Their cruel laughter carried through the force field as they discussed the day's conquest. "Did you hear?" one guard said. "They'd found a new species to harvest, some primitives called humans. More slaves for the Empire," another laughed. "Though these Nellarans will do nicely for now. Strong but stupid, perfect workers." One of Sung's cellmates, an elderly farmer, whispered hopefully, "Perhaps these humans will help us, if they're advanced enough." The guard overheard and slammed his weapon against the force field, making them all jump. "Humans won't save you," he sneered. "No one can. The Vrath rule this galaxy, and you're nothing but property now." Sung closed his eyes as the guard's mocking laughter echoed through the cells. But deep inside, a tiny spark of hope remained. Someone, somewhere, had to be strong enough to fight these monsters. If not the humans, then someone else. The alternative, an eternity of slavery for his people, was too horrible to contemplate. Back on the bridge, Dak was already planning his next conquest. The human worlds would fall like all the others, their people broken and enslaved. He had no idea that his arrogance would soon lead to the greatest mistake of his life: underestimating humanity's capacity to fight back against tyranny and cruel oppression. The wheels of fate were already turning, and the galaxy would never be the same. The subjugator's massive engines hummed as it prepared to jump to the next harvest location. In its holds, thousands of Nellaran slaves waited in darkness, while above them, their captors planned humanity's downfall. But the guard's cruel taunt, "Humans won't save you," would soon come back to haunt them in ways none of them could imagine. Captain Wan stood frozen at her command station, staring at the sensor readings in disbelief. After 15 years of deep space exploration, she had seen many strange things, but nothing like this. The derelict ship they discovered drifting in the asteroid field was massive, easily 3 times the size of her own vessel. "Run those scans again," she ordered, her voice tight with tension. "I want to be absolutely certain." Her science officer tapped rapidly at his console. "Confirmed, Captain. The readings are correct. We're detecting over 800 life signs in suspended animation. They're packed into storage pods like cargo." The bridge of the Earth exploration vessel, Horizon, fell silent as the implications sank in. They had discovered their first evidence of galactic slavery. The pods were crammed into the ship's hold, stacked floor to ceiling with no regard for the comfort or safety of their occupants. "Life support status?" Juan asked, dreading the answer. "Failing, ma'am. Whatever happened to this ship? It's been drifting for weeks. The pods are starting to malfunction. If we don't do something soon, these people will die." Juan straightened her uniform and made the only decision she could. "Prepare emergency boarding parties. We're getting those people out." "Ma'am," her tactical officer Kyung's voice cut through the activity. "We're being hailed by an unknown vessel. It just appeared on our scans. Must have been hiding behind the asteroid field." Juan turned to the main view screen just as a massive warship emerged from behind a tumbling rock the size of a small moon. The vessel was unlike anything in Earth's database, black and predatory, bristling with weapons. The Horizon, designed for exploration rather than combat, suddenly felt very small and vulnerable. The screen flickered, and a holographic figure materialized on their bridge. The alien was tall and reptilian, with gleaming scales and cruel eyes. Its uniform marked it as some kind of military commander. "I am Commander Dak of the Vrath Empire," the figure announced in perfectly translated English. "You are interfering with our property. Surrender your vessel immediately or be destroyed." Juan felt her crew's eyes on her. This was humanity's first contact with an advanced alien civilization, and it had to be with slavers. She stood tall, meeting the alien's gaze. "I am Captain Juan of the Earth exploration vessel Horizon," she responded, keeping her voice steady. "We are representatives of Earth and its colonies. We don't recognize your authority, and we certainly don't surrender to slave traders." Dak's scaled face twisted in what might have been amusement. Brave words from such a primitive species. "You have no concept of the power you're defying. The Vrath Empire rules this sector of space. Those slaves are our property by right of conquest. Where we come from, people can't be property," Juan replied. "Those beings in the pods are dying. We're going to help them, with or without your permission." The alien commander's amusement vanished. "You dare to challenge the Vrath? Your species must be even more primitive than I thought. Let me educate you on your situation, Captain. My ship's weapons could vaporize your vessel in seconds. Submit now, and perhaps I'll be merciful enough to keep your crew alive as servants." Juan's tactical officer whispered urgently, "Captain, their weapons are powering up. Our shields won't stand a chance against that kind of firepower." Juan knew she was in an impossible situation. Her ship was no match for the alien warship, but she couldn't abandon hundreds of innocent beings to die in those pods. More importantly, she couldn't let Earth's first contact with advanced alien life end in submission to slavers. It would set a terrible precedent. "Commander Dak," she said carefully, "think about what you're doing. We're an exploration vessel, but we're not defenseless. If you destroy us, Earth will know what happened. They'll know about your slavery, your empire, everything. Is that really how you want to start relations with a new species?" Dak's hologram flickered as he considered her words. "You show spirit, Captain. Perhaps your species will make good slaves after all. This is your final warning. Surrender, or—" His image vanished as Kyung shouted, multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. "Earth Defense Force signatures." Juan allowed herself a small smile. The emergency beacon she'd activated when they first found the derelict had worked. 3 Earth warships materialized around them, their weapons already tracking the wrecked vessel. "This is Admiral Chen of the EDF," a new voice announced on all channels. "Commander Dak, power down your weapons and withdraw, or we will open fire." The wrecked warship hung in space for a long moment. Then, slowly, it began to turn away. "This isn't over," Dak's voice crackled through the comm. "You've made a very dangerous enemy today." As the alien ship vanished into faster-than-light travel, Juan finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. Humanity's first contact had been hostile, but they had stood their ground. Now they had 800 survivors to save, and a galaxy that had just become much more dangerous. In auxiliary control, Mamai and the other slaves worked quickly to release their people. Alarms blared as holding cells throughout the ship opened. The few remaining guards were overwhelmed by the sheer number of freed slaves. "Look," Jun pointed at the viewport. Human ships were surrounding them, cutting off any escape route. Their weapons were powered but not firing. A transmission cut through all channels. "Wracked vessels, this is New Seoul Defense Command. Surrender now. Your slaves are free. Your ships are crippled. This is your only warning." Mai watched the battles end with tears in her eyes. The impossible had happened. Someone had finally beaten the wrack. And as she looked at the determination on her fellow slaves' faces, she knew this was only the beginning. "They were wrong," she said softly. "They thought humans would be easy prey. Instead, they've awakened something they can't control." Above New Seoul, the mighty wracked fleet hung powerless in space, their reign of terror finally meeting its match in humanity's defiance. Mi's muscles ached as she completed another round of combat exercises. 6 months had passed since her escape from the wrecked slave ship during the Battle of New Seoul. Now she trained daily at a secret facility deep in Earth's Rocky Mountains, alongside hundreds of other refugees from dozens of enslaved species. The training center was hidden underground, carved into the mountain itself. The humans had built it specifically to teach former slaves how to fight back against their oppressors. Mi shared quarters with beings of all shapes and sizes, some with scales, others with fur, some with extra limbs or eyes, all of them united by their hatred of the wrath. Again, Instructor Song called out, "Remember to keep your guard up while striking." The human woman moved with fluid grace as she demonstrated the fighting move once more. Despite her small size compared to many of the aliens, she could take down opponents 3 times her size. Mai watched carefully before repeating the movement. Her Nillaran body, evolved for farming and physical labor, was becoming stronger in new ways. The humans didn't just teach fighting. They taught strategy, technology, and most importantly, hope. "Better," Song nodded approvingly. "You're learning quickly, Mai. Your people's natural strength gives you an advantage. You just need to learn how to use it." In another part of the facility, other refugees learned to operate human weapons and equipment. The humans had developed special modifications to account for different alien physiologies. Some species had 3 fingers, others had claws, but the weapons worked for all of them. During meal breaks, Mai listened to new arrivals tell stories of growing slave resistance across wracked territory. The humans had established a vast underground network, helping slaves escape and providing them with weapons and training. Ships would appear from nowhere, strike at slave transports, and vanish before the wrath could respond. "Your people have suffered enough," Song told Mai one evening as they reviewed combat footage. "It's time you learned to defend yourselves. The wrath aren't invincible. They just want everyone to think they are." Min nodded, remembering her own shock at seeing human ships tear through the supposedly unstoppable wrack fleet. "How did you develop weapons that could defeat their shields?" Song smiled. "We study them carefully after our first contact. The wrack have used the same technology for centuries. They never expected anyone to find its weaknesses. That's their greatest flaw. They don't innovate because they don't think they need to." Across the galaxy, Commander Dak was learning this lesson the hard way. In his command center on the wrack throne world, he received yet another report of slave revolts. This time, An entire mining colony had risen up, using human-made weapons to overwhelm their guards. "How are they getting these weapons?" he raged, smashing his fist into a display screen. "Every slave transport we capture is empty. Every raid on human worlds finds nothing." His intelligence officers had no answers. Somehow, the humans were always one step ahead. Slave revolts were spreading like a virus through Vrak territory. Species that had been subjugated for generations were suddenly fighting back with sophisticated tactics and technology. Back on Earth, Mamai and her fellow trainees learned more than just fighting. They learned about human history, about how Earth's different peoples had fought against slavery and oppression in their own past. They learned that victory didn't always require superior strength. Sometimes it just required unshakable determination. "Humans understand slavery in a way the Vrak never will," Song explained during a history lesson. "Our ancestors fought wars to end it on our own world. When we encountered the Vrak, we knew we couldn't let their empire of slavery continue. Begin rescue operations," she ordered, "and send a priority message to Earth Command. They need to know what we're dealing with out here." Commander Dak's claws dug into the armrests of his command chair, leaving deep scratches in the metal. The attack on the human colony world of New Seoul should have been simple, a quick raid to teach these upstart humans their place. Instead, his fleet was being torn apart by defenses unlike anything he'd seen in centuries of slave-taking. Multiple direct hits on Assault Group 3, his tactical officer shouted. "Their shields are completely gone." Dak watched in disbelief as human fighters swarmed one of his heavy cruisers. The smaller vessels moved with impossible agility, their weapons piercing Vrak shields as if they weren't even there. His own fighters, the terror of countless worlds, were falling by the dozens. "How?" he snarled. "How are they doing this? Their weapons shouldn't be able to touch us." The human colony beneath them was supposed to be defenseless. Instead, hidden gun batteries had emerged from what looked like farming equipment. Defensive shields that didn't show up on scanners had activated the moment his ships entered orbit. Everything about this raid had gone wrong. Deep in the holding cells of Dak's flagship, a Nillaran slave named Mede felt the ship shudder under another impact. The guards were distracted, arguing among themselves about what was happening. She caught fragments of their panicked conversation. Shields failing, weapons ineffective, human ships everywhere. Mai had been a slave for 3 years, watching her captors terrorize helpless worlds. But she had never seen them afraid before. It gave her hope, and hope made her dangerous. "The force field is flickering," she whispered to the others in her cell. All of them were skilled workers, kept aboard to maintain the ship's systems. If the humans hit us again in the right spot. Another blast rocked the ship. The force field containing them sparked and died. The guards were too busy shouting into their communicators to notice. "Now," Mai hissed. She led a group of 20 slaves out of the cell, moving silently as they'd learned to do under their master's cruel watch. Their bare feet made no sound on the metal deck plates. They reached a viewport just in time to see a Vrak heavy cruiser split apart under concentrated fire from human vessels. The smaller ships moved like angry insects, striking from multiple angles with perfect coordination. "Impossible," whispered Jun, another escaped slave beside her. "No one fights the Vrak and wins. No one ever has." But they were winning. The mighty Vrak fleet was in chaos, their formations broken, their vaunted weapons proving useless against human shields. Whatever the humans had developed in their years of isolation, it was more than a match for their would-be slavers. On the bridge, Dak was close to losing control. Half his fleet was crippled or destroyed. The humans had somehow developed weapons that bypassed Vrak shields and tactics that countered centuries of experience. "Launch the ground forces," he roared. "If we can't take their ships, we'll take their people." But the drop ships carrying his troops were shot down before they could enter the atmosphere. Human fighters moved to protect their colony with devastating efficiency. Each Vrak loss was another impossibility, another crack in their image of invincibility. Nye and her fellow escapees found more slaves as they moved through the ship, freeing them from cells where power fluctuations had weakened the force fields. Soon, they were 100 strong, moving through the corridors like shadows. The auxiliary control room, Mai decided. We can open all the slave pens from there. They encountered few guards. Most had been called to battle stations. Those they did find were quickly overwhelmed by desperate slaves who had nothing left to lose. Centuries of cruelty had taught the slaves all too well how to be violent when they needed to be. Through the viewports, they watched human ships methodically dismantling the Vrak fleet. There was no mercy, no quarter offered. The humans fought with cold precision, like they had studied their enemy and prepared specifically to counter them. Status report. Dak demanded on the bridge. 70% of the fleet is disabled or destroyed. His tactical officer replied, voice shaking. The humans are targeting our engines. They're not trying to kill us. They're trapping us here. Dak felt real fear for the first time in his life. These humans weren't just fighting back. They were hunting them. All his years of breaking other species, and he had never imagined being on the other side. Begin rescue operations, she ordered, and send a priority message to Earth Command. They need to know what we're dealing with out here. Commander Dak's claws dug into the armrests of his command chair, leaving deep scratches in the metal. The attack on the human colony world of New Seoul should have been simple, a quick raid to teach these upstart humans their place. Instead, his fleet was being torn apart by defenses unlike anything he'd seen in centuries of slave-taking. Multiple direct hits on Assault Group 3. His tactical officer shouted. Their shields are completely gone. Dak watched in disbelief as human fighters swarmed one of his heavy cruisers. The smaller vessels moved with impossible agility, their weapons piercing Vrak shields as if they weren't even there. His own fighters, the terror of countless worlds, were falling by the dozens. How? He snarled. How are they doing this? Their weapons shouldn't be able to touch us. The human colony beneath them was supposed to be defenseless. Instead, hidden gun batteries had emerged from what looked like farming equipment. Defensive shields that didn't show up on scanners had activated the moment his ships entered orbit. Everything about this raid had gone wrong. Deep in the holding cells of Dak's flagship, a Nillaran slave named Mede felt the ship shudder under another impact. The guards were distracted, arguing among themselves about what was happening. She caught fragments of their panicked conversation. Shields failing, weapons ineffective, human ships everywhere. Mai had been a slave for 3 years, watching her captors terrorize helpless worlds. But she had never seen them afraid before. It gave her hope, and hope made her dangerous. The force field is flickering, she whispered to the others in her cell. All of them were skilled workers, kept aboard to maintain the ship's systems. If the humans hit us again in the right spot. Another blast rocked the ship. The force field containing them sparked and died. The guards were too busy shouting into their communicators to notice. Now, Mai hissed. She led a group of 20 slaves out of the cell, moving silently as they'd learned to do under their master's cruel watch. Their bare feet made no sound on the metal deck plates. They reached a viewport just in time to see a Vrak heavy cruiser split apart under concentrated fire from human vessels. The smaller ships moved like angry insects, striking from multiple angles with perfect coordination. Impossible, whispered Jun, another escaped slave beside her. No one fights the Vrak and wins. No one ever has. But they were winning. The mighty Vrak fleet was in chaos, their formations broken, their vaunted weapons proving useless against human shields. Whatever the humans had developed in their years of isolation, it was more than a match for their would-be slavers. On the bridge, Dak was close to losing control. Half his fleet was crippled or destroyed. The humans had somehow developed weapons that bypassed Vrak shields and tactics that countered centuries of experience. Launch the ground forces, he roared. If we can't take their ships, we'll take their people. But the drop ships carrying his troops were shot down before they could enter the atmosphere. Human fighters moved to protect their colony with devastating efficiency. Each wrack loss was another impossibility, another crack in their image of invincibility. Nye and her fellow escapees found more slaves as they moved through the ship, freeing them from cells where power fluctuations had weakened the force fields. Soon, they were 100 strong, moving through the corridors like shadows. The auxiliary control room, Mai decided. We can open all the slave pens from there. They encountered few guards. Most had been called to battle stations. Those they did find were quickly overwhelmed by desperate slaves who had nothing left to lose. Centuries of cruelty had taught the slaves all too well how to be violent when they needed to be. Through the viewports, they watched human ships methodically dismantling the wrack fleet. There was no mercy, no quarter offered. The humans fought with cold precision, like they had studied their enemy and prepared specifically to counter them. Status report. Dak demanded on the bridge. 70% of the fleet is disabled or destroyed. His tactical officer replied, voice shaking. The humans are targeting our engines. They're not trying to kill us. They're trapping us here. Dak felt real fear for the first time in his life. These humans weren't just fighting back. They were hunting them. All his years of breaking other species, and he had never imagined being on the other side. The training was harsh but necessary. Many refugees broke down crying during sessions, overwhelmed by memories of their captivity. The humans had counselors from all species to help them cope with their trauma and turn their pain into strength. Mai worked harder than most. She had a natural talent for leadership that the humans noticed and encouraged. Other refugees looked up to her, inspired by her escape story. She knew that someday she would return to free her people, and she wanted to be ready. The Vrak think they can control the galaxy through fear, she told her fellow trainees during an evening gathering. But they don't understand that fear can turn to anger, and anger can make slaves into warriors. Meanwhile, the underground network grew larger and more sophisticated. Human ships, painted with stealth coating that confused Vrak sensors, slipped through space delivering weapons and supplies to resistance cells. Former slaves who completed their training returned to their worlds as leaders and teachers. Song watched Mai's progress with pride. The Nillaran woman had transformed from a scared refugee into a confident fighter. She embodied everything the humans hoped to achieve, not just rescuing slaves, but teaching them to rescue themselves. Remember, Song told her students, we're not fighting just for revenge. We're fighting for freedom, not just for ourselves, but for every species the Vrak have enslaved. They thought they could own people forever. We're going to prove them wrong. In his command center, Dak read another report of a successful slave revolt. This time they had captured an entire Vrak warship. His claws dug into the arm of his chair as he realized a terrible truth. By attacking that human colony 6 months ago, he had awakened something far more dangerous than any military force. He had awakened hope. The Grand Chamber of Earth's Security Council glittered under crystal chandeliers, its ancient marble walls witnessing history in the making. Representatives from 12 different species filled the room, their diverse forms creating a living rainbow of colors, textures, and shapes. Some floated in special anti-gravity chairs, others stood on multiple legs, while some required special environmental suits to breathe Earth's air. Admiral Juan, her uniform crisp and decorated with the battle ribbons from New Seoul, stood at the podium. Beside her, Mai had exchanged her training clothes for the traditional flowing robes of a Nillaran elder. Both women had come far since their first encounter with the Vrak 6 months ago. Today marks the beginning of a new era in galactic history, Juan announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. The Liberation Alliance is more than just a military coalition. It is a promise that no species will ever again suffer under the yoke of slavery. The Liberation Charter lay open on the ancient wooden table, its pages containing the combined hopes of billions of beings. Each representative would sign it in their own way, some with hands, others with tentacles or energy signatures. All equal, all free. Mai stepped forward to speak, her voice steady and strong. Gone was the terrified slave who had escaped during a space battle. In her place stood a leader who had earned the respect of both former slaves and their human allies. "The Vrak think they know everything about subjugating other species," she declared, "but they know nothing about the power of cooperation. They see our differences as weaknesses to exploit. We see them as strengths to combine." The chamber erupted in agreement. A Centaurian delegate raised all four arms in support, while a group of crystalline beings chimed in harmonic resonance. The Vrak had enslaved them all, never imagining their victims would one day unite against them. Each species brought unique abilities to the alliance. The Nellarans' agricultural expertise would feed their combined forces. The crystalline Elxthi could communicate across vast distances instantly. The massive Urkai, bred for heavy labor, had incredible strength and endurance. Our human allies, Mai continued, have shown us that victory doesn't require overwhelming force. It requires courage, innovation, and most importantly, unity. The Vrakth Empire is built on fear and division. Ours will be built on trust and cooperation. Admiral Vwan watched with pride as the signing ceremony began. Each representative approached the charter in turn, adding their mark to history. The humans had provided the spark, but the former slaves had built this alliance themselves. They had learned not just to fight, but to lead. In orbit above Earth, the combined fleet of the Liberation Alliance stretched across space. Ships of all shapes and sizes, many captured from the Vrak, others built in secret human shipyards. Their crews were mixed. Former slaves working alongside human trainers, learning to operate the advanced technology that would win their freedom. "Look at what they created," Juan whispered to Mai as another delegate signed the charter. The Vrak thought they were creating a workforce. Instead, they created an army. Mai nodded solemnly. They never understood that slaves dream of freedom. Every lash of the whip, every cruel word, every family torn apart. They were building their own destruction, one tragedy at a time. The final signature was added with great ceremony. A representative of the Urkai pressing their massive hand into a special pad that recorded their biosignature. The Liberation Charter was complete. As if on cue, reports began flowing in from across Vrak space. Slave revolts were erupting on dozens of worlds simultaneously. The underground network, built carefully over months of preparation, was finally revealing its true power. "The first phase begins," Juan announced to the assembly. "Even now, our forces are moving to support the uprisings. The Vrak will find themselves fighting on 100 fronts at once." Mai felt tears in her eyes as she watched the strategic displays. Green lights showed successful liberation operations, spreading like stars across the galactic map. The careful training, the secret preparation, the hidden weapon catches, everything was coming together. "To freedom," she said softly, raising her hand in the traditional Nilaran gesture of blessing. "To freedom," the chamber echoed in a dozen different languages. In the heart of Vrak space, Commander Dak would soon discover just how badly he had underestimated his former property. The Liberation Alliance was no ragtag band of escaped slaves. It was a carefully organized force, armed with human technology and driven by an unshakable determination to be free. The war for liberation had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. The first signs of revolution came at dawn across 100 worlds. In mines, factories, and labor camps throughout Vrak space, slaves who had spent generations in chains suddenly revealed hidden weapons and communication devices. Guards who had grown lazy from years of unchallenged authority found themselves overwhelmed by coordinated attacks. On the mining world of Krasvor, Vrak overseers woke to find their security systems disabled by careful sabotage. Before they could raise the alarm, teams of former slaves using human-designed stealth gear had already captured their weapon depots. By midnight, the planet's entire Vrak garrison had surrendered. Commander Dak stood in his command center, watching in horror as red warning lights spread across the strategic display. Reports flooded in faster than his staff could process them. Slave revolts, security breaches, communications blackouts. military installations falling to surprise attacks. "This is impossible," he snarled, smashing a display screen with his clawed fist. "How can they be attacking everywhere at once?" The answer came in the form of Liberation Alliance warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel above key Vrac worlds. The combined fleet, led by Admiral Juan with Mai as her strategic advisor, had planned this moment for months. "All ships, commence Operation Daybreak." Juan's voice carried across the fleet's secure channels. "Remember your training. Remember why we fight." Mai stood beside her on the bridge of the flagship Freedom, watching as former slaves piloted captured Vrac vessels with deadly precision. The humans had taught them well, showing them how to turn their oppressors' own weapons against them. On the slave world of Terminus, the largest Vrac labor camp erupted in carefully planned chaos. Slaves who had spent months practicing in secret launched simultaneous attacks on guard towers. Human-supplied weapons pierced Vrac shields as if they were paper. By sunset, the camp's massive gates had been thrown open, releasing a flood of newly freed beings. Dak's own officers began questioning his leadership as more reports of defeat arrived. "How did we not see this coming?" his second-in-command demanded. "They've infiltrated every facility, corrupted our most loyal servants. They're just slaves," Dak roared back. "Their property, nothing more." But his words rang hollow as another display showed a Vrac battlecruiser falling to a combined attack by former slave crews. The Liberation Alliance had turned the Vrac's greatest weakness against them, their absolute certainty in their own superiority. In orbit above the Vrac factory world of Nexus Prime, Admiral Juan's fleet executed a perfect pincer movement. While the main force engaged the defensive fleet head-on, smaller ships slipped through the chaos to deliver weapons to the waiting slave population below. Status report. Juan commanded as another Vrac vessel surrendered. Slave uprising successful on 87% of targeted worlds. Mai reported, her voice steady despite her excitement. Vrac forces are divided, trying to respond to too many threats at once. The revolution had been years in planning. While the Vrac focused on human ships and weapons, they had missed the real danger, the quiet determination of beings who had nothing left to lose. Every act of cruelty had taught their slaves patience. Every punishment had taught them resilience. On the agricultural world of Harvest 9, Nellaran farm workers who had spent generations feeding the Empire suddenly turned their harvesting machines into weapons. Human engineers had shown them how to modify the equipment, hiding weapons and communication gear inside ordinary farming tools. Dak's command center dissolved into chaos as more reports arrived. Slave transports were being captured by their cargo. Mining facilities were being turned into fortresses. Even the most loyal servant species were turning against their masters. "We have to protect the core worlds," an officer shouted. "Recall the fleet." "No," Dak snarled. "We can't show weakness. These slaves must be taught their place." But his empire was already crumbling. The Liberation Alliance had struck perfectly, hitting too many targets at once for any effective response. Centuries of oppression were ending in days of carefully orchestrated revolution. Mai watched another display light up as a slave world declared its independence. She remembered her own escape, how impossible freedom had seemed then. Now she stood on the bridge of a warship, helping to coordinate the liberation of millions. "The Vrac never understood," she told Juan quietly. "They thought breaking our bodies would break our spirits. Instead, it just taught us how to put ourselves back together." Around them, the revolution continued to spread. The Vrac Empire had spent centuries building the greatest slave empire in history. They never realized they were actually building the greatest liberation army ever seen. Freedom, once ignited, burned like wildfire through the stars. The green fields of Nilara stretched endlessly below, just as they had the day the Vrac first arrived. But now the planet's peaceful skies were filled with warships. The Liberation Alliance fleet, thousands strong, faced off against Commander Dak's remaining forces in what would become the final battle of the slave empire. Admiral Juan stood on the bridge of the Freedom, her fleet arranged in perfect formation. Beside her, Mai watched her homeworld through the view screen, remembering the day she was taken as a slave. Now she had returned as a leader, ready to end the empire that had caused so much suffering. "All ships report ready," the tactical officer announced. "Former slave crews are in position." The Vrak fleet was impressive, but their formation showed their desperation. Dak had gathered his remaining loyal forces for one final stand above the world where his empire had first encountered humanity. The massive subjugator still led his fleet, its black hull scarred from countless battles. "Open a channel to all frequencies," Juan ordered. "Let everyone hear this." "Channel open, Admiral." Juan's voice rang across space, heard by every ship and station in range. "Commander Dak, this is Admiral Juan of the Liberation Alliance. Your empire is finished. Surrender now, and we will show mercy." There was a long pause before Dak's response crackled through. "Never. You think these slaves can defeat us? They are nothing without their human masters." Mai stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "You were wrong, Dak. Humans didn't save us. They taught us to save ourselves. Look at your fleet. Those aren't human ships facing you. Those are your former slaves, flying vessels we captured from you." She was right. The Liberation Fleet was mostly composed of captured Vrak ships, now crewed by the very beings they had once transported as cargo. Former slaves had learned to operate the technology that had once imprisoned them. "All ships, execute pattern liberation," Juan commanded. The battle erupted like a storm. Ships that had once been slave transports now fired on their former masters. Crews that had been worked to exhaustion in mines and factories now demonstrated perfect battle tactics, their movements coordinated with precision that shocked the Vrak commanders. On the subjugator's bridge, Dak watched in fury as his fleet began to crumble. The Liberation forces moved with impossible coordination, using strategies the Vrak had never seen before. Every attempt to counter them failed. "How?" he roared as another of his ships fell. "They're just slaves. They're property." But his words meant nothing now. The Liberation Fleet pressed forward, their attacks guided by former slaves who knew every weakness in Vrak ship design. They had maintained these vessels for generations. Now they knew exactly where to strike. May felt tears in her eyes as she watched her people fight. Nelaran ships flew alongside vessels crewed by dozens of other species. The Vrak had spent centuries keeping their slaves divided. Now that unity was their downfall. "Target the subjugator," Juan ordered. "All ships, concentrated fire." The massive slaver vessel's shields buckled under the combined assault. Escape pods began launching as its crew abandoned ship. On its bridge, Dak realized too late the magnitude of his mistake. He had ruled through fear and cruelty, never imagining his victims would learn to fight back. The subjugator's bridge exploded in a brilliant flash. As its burning hulk drifted through space, cheers erupted across thousands of worlds. Slaves who had lived their entire lives in chains watched through communications channels as their greatest oppressor fell. In the years that followed, the phrase, "humans won't save you," took on a new meaning. It became a reminder that freedom wasn't given. It was earned through cooperation, determination, and courage. The former slave worlds built a new society, one based on mutual respect and understanding. Mai often visited the battlefield memorial above Nilara, where pieces of the subjugator were preserved as a reminder. She would bring her children there, telling them stories not just of human help, but of how beings from across the galaxy learned to help themselves. "The humans didn't save us," she would tell them. "They showed us we could save ourselves, and that was worth more than any rescue." The Vrakth Empire faded into history, remembered only as a warning of how cruelty could bring about its own destruction. In its place rose something new, an alliance of free peoples who understood that true strength came not from domination, but from standing together against those who would enslave others. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Never again would any species dare to build an empire on the backs of slaves. The price of freedom had been high, but its value was beyond measure. And among the stars, ships of the Liberation Alliance continued their patrols, crewed by beings of all species, ready to defend the freedom they had fought so hard to win.